September 1945 brings the joy of liberation to South Korea. But for many, that joy is short-lived. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a Korean War in real-time background special. In the last background special, I looked at a few hundred years of Korean history, the situation under the Japanese occupation, the division of the country at the end of World War II, and the arrival of the American and Soviet forces. When we left the story, it was just after September 8, 1945, and General John Hodge's 24th Corps had landed at Incheon to begin the occupation of the American half of Korea. Feel free to call it an invasion. Hodge's first task is to try and set up some sort of government. The U.S. State Department tells him to create a government in harmony with U.S. policies. But Hodge has no ideas what U.S. policies and interests are in Korea. No one has told him. Then there's the question of the Korean people. How should they be treated? Theater's Supreme Commander, General Douglas MacArthur, says the Koreans must be treated as liberated people. But Hodge has no information on whom he can trust among the numerous groups that claim a political mandate. So in the end, he takes a very soldierly approach to things. He tells his officers to regard Korea as an enemy of the United States and subject to the terms of the Japanese surrender. Hodge has no desire whatsoever to get involved in any Korean politics. Instead, he turns to the people he knows have at least some experience governing the country in a stable manner: the Japanese. He sees to it that, at least for the near future, Japanese officials stay at their posts in Korea. Japanese remains the language of official communications, and Japanese soldiers and police still have responsibility for law and order. Naturally, many Koreans are seriously offended and angry by the closeness between their old occupiers, the often brutal colonial masters who wanted to destroy their entire culture, and their supposed liberators. This may all sound strange, considering they've just fought a brutal war against each other, but as Bruce Cummings writes in The Origins of the Korean War, although any generalizations along these lines must be impressionistic and hazarded with care, it does seem that from the beginning many Americans simply liked the Japanese better than the Koreans. The Japanese were viewed as cooperative, orderly, and docile, while the Koreans were seen as headstrong, unruly, and obstreperous. Eventually, the Americans do start sending the Japanese home. But who is to replace them? Well, there is a provisional government ready and waiting to rule. See, in the days immediately after the Japanese surrender, on August 15th, a whole load of people's committees sprang up across both North and South Korea, with some 150 of them active by just the end of the month. Despite the socialist-sounding name, they encompass a broad alliance of communists, leftists, nationalists, conservatives, and anti-Japanese resistance groups drawn together in temporary cohesion through the euphoria of liberation. These committees get together and form a government for what they hope will be a new People's Republic of Korea, PRK. From the start, though, the Americans are alarmed by the large influence of the communists and dismiss the entire PRK as stooges of Moscow. In the North, the Soviets are also facing challenges about who to put in power. In Eastern Europe, they've been able to harness the rise of left-wing movements, subjugate the leadership, or install pro-Moscow leaders, and then turn that into an administration. In Korea, they probably could cobble together a makeshift administration using the communist elements of the People's Committees, but the problem is that the Korean communists are different from their Eastern European counterparts. They're generally more nationalistic and independently minded, with only a tenuous grip on what Moscow would call proper Marxist-Leninist theory. But who else is there? Well, there are the returning members of the Yan'an group, the Korean communists who fled to China in the 1930s. But after more than 10 years fighting alongside the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviets decide these guys are too sympathetic to Mao Zedong to be reliable. There are also a lot of ethnic Koreans living in the Soviet Union, many of whom fit the bill perfectly, loyal to Stalin, educated in the proper theory, and familiar with Soviet-style governance. The Soviets do not, though, consider any of them for the position of leader. Heck, many of them have not even set foot in Korea. No, the man at the top will have to come from somewhere else. That leaves the Soviets with the Korean communists who would join the Red Army, men like Kim Il-sung. Kim is a known and reliable quantity, and the Soviets worked quickly to install him as North Korean leader. They set to work establishing a cult of personality and unveil Kim to the North Korean people as a military genius and hero already October 14th, 1945. Kim was a fairly successful guerrilla fighter against the Japanese back in the day, but the Soviet portrayal of him is, shall we say, generous. He's also portrayed as a prominent and distinguished political leader. In reality, the opposite seems to be true. The Soviets see Kim as uncharismatic and lacking in imagination, but ruthlessly efficient and loyal, exactly the kind of man to do Moscow's bidding. It should come as little surprise, then, that when Kim is parachuted in from above, he fails to appeal to the local Korean communists, not to mention the returnees from Yan'an. But the Soviets will brook no opposition, and they set about building the apparatus of power. They disarm returning Korean guerrillas at the border, except for Kim's men, and these are to be given positions in the new government and the security forces that will go on to become the North Korean Army, the KPA. The People's Committees are stacked with more pliable members, and opposition, both communist and non-communist, is eliminated by one means or another. The North Korean Communist Party, the NKCP, is established on December 18th, and Kim is in effective control of it. Things are quite different in the South, where the complex web of tension and mistrust between the left and the right, and between the nationalists and the Americans, is close to its boiling point. Although Hodge has begun sending the Japanese civil servants and administrators home, the people he is replacing them with were Korean collaborators with the Japanese, and were trained by the Japanese. They are the only ones right now who have the skills and knowledge to run the country on a day-to-day basis. Hodge also wages a fierce campaign against the PRK and the resurgent labor unions, all of which he views as subversive agents of Moscow. He cables MacArthur November 25th that this will constitute, in effect, a declaration of war upon the communistic elements in Korea. On the international stage, the division between North and South Korea comes into sharp relief. On December 27th, the Allied powers meet in Moscow, where the US, China, Britain, and Soviet Union agree that Korea should be placed under a four-power trusteeship for up to 5 years to prepare the country for independence under a unified Korean government. The Soviets are willing to give this seeming concession because they believe that the communist movement is so strong both in North and South that a unified independent Korea will eventually come under Soviet-friendly communist leadership. Pretty much everyone else can also see that this is the game plan. In South Korea, the nationalists and the political right organize strikes and demonstrations against such trusteeship. Also, Hodge is furious about what he sees as a surrender to the Soviets, and pretty soon, Washington comes to share his view. So despite his earlier hopes for some accommodation, by February 1946, U.S. President Harry Truman has decided a strong stand is needed against growing global Soviet expansionism. The breach between the U.S. and the Soviets continues to widen as the Cold War heats up. Stalin gives a speech in February 1946 declaring that communism and capitalism are incompatible. On March the 5th, Winston Churchill says that an iron curtain has descended on Europe. By then, the idea of a trusteeship is essentially dead, even as the American-Soviet Commission arrives in Korea to begin working on a unified administration. By the 8th of May, when the commission adjourned indefinitely, it had become clear that Korea would remain indefinitely divided into two antagonistic client states. The Soviets worked quickly to begin sealing North Korea off from the South. Within weeks, the economic foundations for an autonomous state and the political foundations of a socialist state in the North were laid, including the promulgation of a new basic civil law code, the achievement of rapid land reform, and the nationalization of all remaining ex-Japanese industry and property. This was accompanied by measures to both defend and isolate the embryonic state, including the strengthening of defense installations along the 38th parallel, the restriction of movement between North and South, and the intensification of communist militancy in the South. Kim and his Soviet backers move to secure his position. His party merges with the Yan'an faction to become the North Korean Workers' Party, the NKWP, and they win 97% of the vote in elections at the provincial, county, and city levels People's Committees. By February 1947, they dominate the newly formed People's Assembly. Meanwhile, in South Korea, the situation looks like it is spiraling out of control as waves of violence shake the country. The background to it all is the rapid deterioration of economic conditions after the end of the Second World War. See, the Korean economy was basically geared entirely towards supporting Japan. Industry toiled for the imperial war machine, and foreign trade was conducted almost entirely within the Japanese Empire. Korea was dependent on Japanese economic expertise, on the colonial banking and financial infrastructure, and on Japanese senior managers and technicians. Since August 1945, the total number of factories in operation has declined by 44%, and those still running are doing so at an average of just 20% of their wartime capacity. State revenues from land taxes, public utilities, and government monopolies have also dropped sharply. For a while, the South Koreans were shielded by a resilient agricultural sector, but in 1946, poor weather and the lack of Japanese fertilizer resulted in food shortages, huge price increases, and rampant speculation. It is the urban poor who are hardest hit. Attempts to subsidize grain by printing cash just increase inflation. Within a year of the end of Japanese occupation, price increases outstrip wages in Seoul by a ratio of 5-2. This all comes to a head in the autumn of 1946, when about 250,000 workers go on strike across the country, demanding better working conditions and housing, increases in the rice ration, and the transfer of power back to the People's Committees. There is violence in those strikes. Hundreds are injured, and some people are killed in clashes with the police. But far worse is to come on October 2nd, when there's a full-on uprising in Daegu after the police kill a demonstrator the day before. Over the following days and weeks, mobs several thousand strong attack police stations and actually lynch police officers, all the while calling for the American occupiers to leave. The Korean police and American soldiers fire into the crowds. They are supported by right-wing Korean vigilantes. By the end of it all, hundreds of workers, rioters, and police are dead. Hodge sees all of this as further evidence of a continued communist takeover campaign. He's not entirely wrong either. The South Korean communists are in the vanguard of the action, and the North is sending infiltrators down. But many of those doing the striking, rioting, and killing are not committed communists. Rather, they are motivated by simpler economic concerns, a desire for independence from the U.S., and a resentment of the brutal Korean police force. That last point is very important. Here's something from Max Hastings that talks of the scale of the problem under American occupation. The National Police, the most detested instrument of Japanese tyranny, was not merely retained, but strengthened. The 12,000 Japanese in their ranks were sent home, but the 8,000 Koreans who remained, the loyal servants of a brutal tyranny in which torture and judicial murder had been basic instruments of government, found themselves promoted to fill the higher ranks, while total police strength in South Korea doubled. A long roll call of prominent torturers and anti-nationalist fighters under the colonial power found themselves in positions of unprecedented authority. In the end, though, the autumn violence only hurts the communist cause. Not only have they overestimated the appetite for revolution in the South, but the non-communist left completely disavows any association with the communists. The communist leadership is arrested, goes to ground, or flees to the north. Given these events of late 1946, it looks like the U.S. might get sucked into things here for who knows how long. So the American government is looking to install a compliant anti-communist government in the South and disengage from it, pending some sort of peaceful reunification of the peninsula. With any prospect of a bilateral American-Soviet agreement dead, the U.S. decides to hand the problem over to the United Nations. In November 1947, the Security Council agrees to a U.S. resolution for the establishment of a UN Temporary Committee on Korea, UNTCOC. UNTCOC decides there will be elections for a unified National Assembly next year. Once that happens, the UN will take over the transfer of power and all foreign forces will be withdrawn from Korea. Well, that sounds great. There is one small problem, or a few small problems. The Soviets have boycotted that UN vote, and they and the North Koreans completely reject any United Nations involvement on the Korean peninsula. So too do the South Korean communists and much of the left. Still, after putting the matter to a vote, the UN decides to go ahead with the elections, but only in such parts of Korea as are accessible to the Commission. In effect, this means South Korea only. It is this which sets the division of the peninsula in stone. The South Korean left boycotts the election campaign, so it is then essentially a free run for the American choice for president, the conservative Syngman Rhee. I talked about him in the Background Part 1 episode, and how he'd been the foremost advocate for Korean independence in the US before the Second World War. Well, he returned to Korea in mid-October 1945, flown into Seoul aboard MacArthur's personal plane. Since then, he has become the most prominent politician in the South and has united much of the Korean conservative movement behind him. Having been educated in America, Rhee also has the advantage of being fluent in English, unlike most of his rivals. That doesn't mean he always sees eye to eye with the Americans. They often use words like stubborn, prickly, or acerbic to describe him. Above all, though, Rhee is a staunch anti-communist. So much so, in fact, that the Americans even sidelined him back in '45 while they were looking for some sort of accommodation with the Soviets. But now with Truman taking a harder line against Moscow, Rhee is back in favor. They believe he is the only man who can form a stable government. But an American alignment with Rhee means an alignment with some very dark forces indeed. During the election campaign, Rhee's political movement demonstrates its willingness to deploy extreme violence. Also, by late 1947, William Dean, yep, same guy who's back in July 1950, leading U.S. 24th Division, is somewhat complicit in giving a free hand to Rhee's thugs. It was he who authorized the Korean police to deputize bands of loyal citizens into community protective organizations. These quickly became known colloquially among Americans as Rhee's goon squads. Their purpose was frankly terroristic, to drive not only communists, but any group unsympathetic to the right from South Korean life. In the 6 weeks before polling, 589 people were killed in disturbances and 10,000 processed at police stations. Rhee's supporters win 55 seats in the 200-member National Assembly, while the Conservative Democratic Party comes second with 39 seats. Two other right-wing groups win 12 and 6 seats, respectively. The right-wing Majority Assembly debates the new constitution, and on August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea comes into being, with Rhee as president. In the North, Kim purges all remaining domestic opposition in March 1948. Communist control over the government is confirmed in August 1948 elections for the Supreme People's Assembly. By September 3rd, Kim's government had passed a new constitution. On September 9th, they proclaimed the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The hastily drawn division on the 38th parallel is now set to be one of the hottest frontiers of the new Cold War. And I'll pick up this tale soon enough in Background Part 3. If you want to see something great from our back pages, check out this episode from Between Two Wars Season 2 about another communist, Vladimir Lenin, and his war on religion late in his life. It'll come up at the end of this. It is the Time Ghost Army that finances all of our productions, so for ever more great history, join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. See you next time.